No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Companies and Affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Why do people commit themselves to the things they do? Why are people so worried about sport? Why wine? Why video games? I'm Brian Lowry, and in this season of my podcast, Know What You See, I'm asking a simple question, but a really big one. What's the point? In conversations with people with a variety of passions and obsessions, we get the chance to look through a window and see what it means to truly focus on a realm of human experience. Join me on Know What You See. New episodes begin November 26th.
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
In English, you say, I'm sorry, forgive me, and it's all about me.
That's Episcopalian priest Mpho Tutu van Furth, daughter of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. After apartheid ended in South Africa, her father became the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated human rights violations. The commission allowed both victims and perpetrators to testify and give statements about their experiences.
In Xhosa, you say ndicela uxolo, which means I ask for peace. And that's a very different thing than forgive me. To say I ask for peace is to recognize that whatever it was that I did, both of us are involved.
Beautiful and challenging interview coming right up.
We, the people, shape our country's story. America 250 is gearing up to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of America's democracy by collecting and preserving diverse stories from across the nation. Nominate any living person you think has a story to be preserved and celebrated for generations to come. Help tell our American story, every unique version of it. Visit america250.org/nominate to submit.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. My guest today is the Reverend Canon Mpho Tutu van Furth. As the daughter of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, she experienced the effects of apartheid in South Africa and endured death threats to her family. But she carries on her father's legacy in pursuit of peace and reconciliation. After apartheid ended in South Africa, her father became the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated human rights violations. The commission allowed both victims and perpetrators to testify and give statements about their experiences. And though, as you'll hear momentarily, she vowed she would never follow in her father's footsteps, she nonetheless has become an Episcopalian priest, as well as an artist and author. She's the Canon Commissioner for Beloved Community in the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe and serves as co-vicar of All Saints Amsterdam. She's married to Marceline van Furth, and they live in the Netherlands. Here's our interview with Mpho Tutu van Furth. Welcome, Mpho.
Thank you.
It's a delight to have you with us, and we're grateful to get to be with you today.
Thank you.
I would like to begin with a question about vocation. You have said publicly that when you were young, you wanted very much not to be a priest, and yet you became a priest. And I'm wondering, how did that happen?
You see one side of priesthood from living in the family of how involved it is and how much a congregation can demand of your time and of your energy and of your attention. And it just seemed like, gosh, this is a lot. And then as I grew older, there's a sense of reflection, of really seeing how much it was that my parents loved what they were doing, they were involved with their whole hearts and in the work that they were involved in. So that piece of decision, that having something that really demands your whole heart and your whole self, was something, as I went along, I realized what I was searching for was a role, a vocation that really demanded my whole self.
What would you say, as you found your way into that vocation, have been 1, 2, 3 at the most major theological convictions or centering points of faith that have been crucial to you in the work that you've sought to do?
God is love, and everything that we do and how we live is to flow from that conviction that God is love and we are to be like God, loving, that God forgives. And that is maybe the most demanding or difficult or challenging aspect of faith is God's forgiveness, because it's such an enormous gift, the gift of forgiveness, that love is almost easy in the sense that love feels like I can get there. Forgiveness can be really hard to get there. It can be really hard to get there. That's two. I think that's two big ones to be able to get along with it, I think. And maybe the third is that we're made for goodness, that we are given everything so that loving and forgiveness aren't impossible for us. They're built into our DNA. And so as difficult or as challenging as they are to us sometimes, it's not part of the makeup. This is a test. It's only a test. And we're trying to make this as hard for you as I possibly can. But it's really, I want you to do this. And I want you to succeed. And so I've given you everything that you need to succeed.
Yeah, thank you. So when you think about your own journey personally, the sort of acceptance of the notion that God is love, or that we are lovable, that others are lovable by God and or by us, or this call to forgiveness or the call to goodness, all three of those that you mentioned, what have been 1 or 2 significant turning points for you personally in living into those convictions or seeing the centrality of those?
Well, the forgiveness one is really daily. It's it's such a daily experience of really needing to be forgiven every day and needing to offer forgiveness every day. There are so many ways that we screw up, before God, but that we screw up before the people who we love, the people in our families, the people who are closest to us, and that we need to offer that grace of forgiveness, and from whom we need to ask that grace of forgiveness. And so, major turning point, no, but deepening recognition, I think. And I think that in the Episcopal Church, in the Anglican Church in which I grew up, we have a general confession. So we're not expected to go to confession. The general confession is a part of our Eucharistic liturgy. It's a part of our daily morning and evening prayer. And sometimes it can feel a little lost in the shuffle, because we don't have to call up the list of the things that we've done or left undone, or the things that we've said or thought or whatever it is, that it can feel a little bit, kind of moving right along, but every so often, the words of that prayer of confession do bring you up short, that we sin, that we need forgiveness for our thoughts, for our words, for our deeds, and for the things that we've left undone. And sometimes it is, ooh, did I really think that? Oh, yeah, I did that thing. Or, I was supposed to X, Y, Z, and I didn't. And I need forgiveness for that. And so I don't think I've had a Damascus experience, But I think that the dailiness of a life with God, who is constantly against all odds, extending the invitation into relationship again and again and again, and calling me back into relationship. And I think that one of the places that really becomes very visible is in my marriage relationship with a person who I love to pieces and who I want to be with and whose company I enjoy, and with whom I get into wonderful fights where I say things that, did I say that? And I have to come to you and ask for forgiveness. Or did you say that and have to come to me and ask for forgiveness? And I need to forgive you in order for us to be able to go on together.
Yeah. You are the daughter of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, winner of the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize for his work against apartheid in South Africa, and then as the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And you've done a lot of work. I think you've written, co-authored maybe 2 books with your father, and then authored as well a biography of your father, and then have been the head of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. So a lot of work there, working at preserving the great legacy of your father. And I wonder if for those who are younger and might not really know many of the stories of apartheid or what that system was like, when you think back to your childhood, what do you remember about kind of the mundane realities of that kind of system and the way it pressed down upon you individually or your family or your friends and the community that you were a part of?
Yeah, I think, it's so difficult to describe the dailiness of living under an oppressive system and the physical reality of living under a system that was so oppressive. I was really privileged. My siblings and I went to boarding school for high school, went to boarding school in Swaziland, which is across the border from South Africa and is a completely different environment. And I just remember the experience of crossing the border. You go through a South African border post and then through a sort of no man's land and then through the Swazi border post. And I just remember the physical sensation of crossing out of South Africa and the physical experience of relief of being outside South Africa. But the experience of living in South Africa for a Black person was an experience of daily, petty indignity. There was grand apartheid, which was you can only live in an area designated for people of your race, that as a Black person, the area that was designated for you was as close as it could be to a slum. Housing was inadequate. In holiday times, I would drive into work with my dad. I was attending an art school in Johannesburg, and we would drive from Soweto into Johannesburg in the morning and then drive back in the evening. And driving back in the evening, there's a slight hollow as you drive into Soweto, and you actually see the air change, because in Soweto at that time there was no electricity. So in most of the houses in Soweto, and people would cook on coal stoves. And so you'd see all of the smoke from the coal burning fires that just hung over the whole township. And ironically, there was a power station right at the edge of Soweto, but the electricity supplied by that power station went to the white area in Johannesburg as opposed to providing power for Soweto, for the township. But there was also the genuine humor and camaraderie and activism that was also bound up in that experience of apartheid. And I think that one of the things that you recognize under apartheid was how resourceful people were. it was clear that the government wasn't going to do anything to make life easier for people. And so you'd have so many people dedicating time, effort, energy, financial resources to helping each other. And so the civic sector was really very strong. There were a lot of nonprofit organizations, NGOs, that were people seeing a need and answering it, from whatever resources they had. And remember that the AIDS crisis really hit close to the end of the Apartheid era, so the 80s and early 90s. And there were any number of women in the townships who would take in AIDS orphans, children who had been orphaned by AIDS, and they would take them in and house them. And most of these women were as far from wealthy as you can possibly get. And they would say, well, I saw a child. I have a plate of food. I can share it. I have a roof over my head. They can sleep here. I have to keep them safe. They're part of our community. And so just that kind of thing that was also driven out of necessity and Ubuntu, both.
You mentioned a moment ago this kind of sense of, even in the midst of those oppressive realities, a sense of camaraderie, or I'm not sure the other words you used, but out of that experience, how would you describe resources, inner resources that men and women, children in that context draw upon in order to not fall prey to despair?
Our resilience is built in the testing. And so people were amazingly resilient. In the South Africa of my growing up, the townships were really constructed as kind of dormitories. And so they weren't well resourced. The grocery stores were not in the townships. The grocery stores were in the city. So if you wanted to do real grocery shopping, you'd have to go into town to do your grocery shopping, and then you'd bring everything back into the township. When I was a teenager, I think there was one cinema, one movie theater in Soweto to serve more than 1 million people. So one of the things was that church became the community center, the entertainment center, like everything happened there. That was, people would come to church on a Sunday. You got a free lecture, music, a little bit of dancing. Hey, it all happened here. It was also the place where people would get to learn about, what's going on in each other's lives and how it is that we can support each other, when a lot of what it meant to offer support was really just to show up and to offer your hands and to be present with one another. The expectation was very seldom that you were coming with money, because nobody had money. What you were coming with was a willingness to stand beside each other.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Mpho Tutu van Furth. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and full transcript. We're very grateful that you join us on the podcast, and we would be most appreciative if you'd go to your favorite podcast app and write up a glowing 5-star review of No Small Endeavor. Those reviews actually serve in a great helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. And we are indeed grateful for the many of you who continue to send us such lovely feedback through those reviews. Thank you. We'll be right back after this break. When do you remember as a child first recognizing the divided nature of the society that you were a part of?
I was born in England. We came back to South Africa when I was about 3 years old. And so I had a very different experience of life than most of my peers. And yeah, I came back to South Africa with a very Pommy accent. And and my mom said, she would be so embarrassed we're in the taxi, and they had these it's sort of a minibus taxi. So there's several people squashed in together, and there I am having this piping call, "Oh, mummy," and so my mom would say, "Yeah, she plays with the madam's children a lot." But my mom would kind of imply she was a domestic worker, and I was playing with her employer's children, and that was wow. That would account for my accent. My father would tell about, we were living in Alice, which is in the Eastern Cape, and is quite close to the ocean. And we would go to Port Elizabeth, because Port Elizabeth was the big city, or King Williamstown, the big cities where we'd go for shopping. And both of them were literally on the coast. So sometimes we'd get to go to the beach, but there were beaches for Black people and then separate beaches for white people. And of course, which ones were the more desirable beaches to go to. But I was walking with my dad, and we went past a park, and there were children playing on the swings, and I wanted to go and play. And my dad was like, "Yeah, no, you can't go and play there. Those swings aren't for you." And I was like, "What do you mean they're not for me? The other children are playing there." And I, that he then had to kind of figure out a way of explaining to me what the difference was between me and the other children who were able to play on the swings. And I think that must have been a bit of heartbreak for him, to have to explain where it was that we were living and what kind of a country it was. And because my father at that time was teaching at what was then called Federal Theological Seminary, which was a multi-denominational Christian seminary. The teaching staff were of all races, as were the students. And so my experience on campus was of a town like any other, where there was all kinds of racial diversity and the children all played together. But as soon as we stepped off campus, we were in the South Africa that people now know about.
There's a passage in one of the books that you co-authored with your father where he's talking about the season in his life in which he increasingly sees he can't be silent, and that as he begins to speak out, the death threats that begin to come to him, and how he would witness your mother, Leah, or one of you all, one of his children, hang up the phone after a call had come in, and he would know that it had been another one of those death threats. And then he says this, I'll read this verbatim. He said, "I asked Leah then if I should stop speaking up. Quite incredibly, she said to me that she would be happier with me on Robben Island, where Mandela and so many other anti-apartheid stalwarts were imprisoned, than silent outside. This emboldened me more than I can say. But each time I saw her or one of our children shaking in rage or fear after answering one of those phone calls, I knew my actions were the cause of their pain." It seemed to me an incredibly poignant picture into the tension that your family, your father in his work had to endure. When you hear those words again, what's that evoke for you, or what's that bring up for you?
I do remember the fear, and not just the death threats and the phone calls, but also they'd do pamphlet drops outside the house. And then I was in high school in Swaziland, which was across the border. and several hours drive away from home. And, there came a time when my dad was on the front pages of the newspapers. And so that I would get news of my parents from the newspapers as opposed to telephone calls, which were expensive and infrequent. And yeah, you can't imagine, now when people have cell phones and WhatsApp and FaceTime and all of those kinds of things, and we can stay in touch on a daily basis, it's unimaginable to be growing up at a time when at our school there was one phone booth, and usually your parents knew to call sometime around 6 o'clock in the evening, which was right as we were getting ready to go into dinner. But you never knew whether to be excited to get a phone call or to dread the phone call, because what did it mean? And the high school that I attended, there were several children of anti-apartheid activists. And so a telephone call really could mean anything. It could mean, your mom's in jail, out of jail, somebody's been served a banning order, all kinds of things. And so you never knew whether you actually really wanted to get a phone call from home. But I do remember being afraid and saying to my dad once that I really get afraid for you. I feel very anxious. And his response was, I'm doing God's work and God has to take care of me. And yeah, that was and God jolly well ought to take care of me. And he said, you can spend your energy worrying, or you can use it to do something more useful instead. And so that was kind of where I ended up putting my energy was, okay, well, let me figure out something more useful to do instead, because the anxiety is doing nobody any favors.
Following the fall of apartheid, in time, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that your father chairs, and in your book, Forgiveness and Reparation, The Healing Journey, you develop this very helpful distinction between different ways of asking for forgiveness. That is, you say that the perpetrators will often say, I'm sorry, forgive me. But what the victims heard was often something quite different. Could you unpack that for us?
It's actually embedded in language. In English, you say, I'm sorry, forgive me, and it's all about me, like I'm this terrible person and I've done all the things wrong and forgive me. And I get to walk off with my forgiveness. I've got it. It's, it's the package you gave me, and off I go and to live my happy life. In Xhosa, you say, ndicela uxolo, which means I ask for peace. And that's a very different thing than forgive me. To say I ask for peace is to recognize that whatever it was that I did, both of us are involved. I hurt you, I damaged the relationship between us, and I have damaged something in myself. And so I cannot be at peace unless you also are at peace, and you cannot be at peace unless I also am at peace. And neither of us can be at peace unless both of us are at peace, and that we have this peace between us. And when you think of forgiveness as building peace, you find yourself leaning into what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, that peace isn't the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice. And that when you ask for Ubuntu forgiveness, you're asking for the presence of justice.
Will you unpack as well more this notion of Ubuntu that you've already began to allude to?
Yeah, Ubuntu, in the West, we say a philosophy, which kind of makes it reside in our heads. It's actually a way of being, it's an approach to living. that my humaneness and my humanity don't happen in isolation. My humanity is intimately connected to your humanity, that we become truly human together in relationship. You see it in the ways that people act. So, for instance, still surprisingly, in South Africa, there's a horrendously high rates of unemployment. And so at each of the supermarkets, there'll be parking guards. Very often, I will say to a parking guard, I don't have any cash to give you a tip, which is, like, I understand that your life depends on the tip, whatever that tip is. In a lot of the places where I'll go, especially because now everybody kind of does those, I can pay with a card, or I can pay with my phone, or I can, that I don't often carry cash. In a lot of the places that I'll go, I'll say, I don't have any cash to give you. And the person will still smile and say, it's fine. It's okay. Next time, another time, you'll be able to give me a tip. This time, I will still push your cart and help you unpack your groceries or pack your groceries into your car, even though you're not going to give me a red cent for doing it. But just that you're engaging in a human interaction with me. Or you'll ask somebody, oh, can you tell me how to get to so-and-so such and such place? And you're walking in one direction, the person's coming in the other direction, and you say to them, oh, can you tell me how to go to so-and-so such and such place? And the person will say, oh, yeah, you turn left, but you know what? I'll take you there, and kind of turn around and go with you to the place that you're going to make sure that you get there. And those kinds of actions of just real deep humanness that I notice that people have just a little bit more time, the 3 ounces more of time that it takes to smile, to say hi, to not act as though you're a bump on a log when you walk into a room, whether or not you need help, whether or not they're going to be able to be of any help to you. Just the thing of, oh, there's another human being. Hi, how are you doing? Go on about your business, but just taking that moment to acknowledge you.
To what degree do you think that Western consumerist society undercuts that sort of way of thinking about community? Or are there other kinds of societal trends that you see as threatening to that sense of simply recognizing, acknowledging the shared humanity of us all?
Yeah, I think that Western consumerist society really does undercut it. And then you don't notice what you're losing until it's so far gone that you don't know how to get it back again. And I just remember the experience of my stepdaughter went to do an internship in South Africa. She's a medical student and spent 3 months there from the Netherlands, and was just, kind of remarking how different it was to be there. That the Netherlands is incredibly efficient, and everything is efficient and everything is really well run. And very much what's going to happen next because it's in somebody's diary that this is what happens next. And South Africa is incredibly chaotic in many ways, and that, and it can be very frustrating because you're not exactly sure what's going to happen next. And yet, in that not being sure what's going to happen next, there is space for serendipity and there is space for joy. Whereas here, because you know what's supposed to happen next, you're not going to go out of your way to do anything that's not on the list. And so if it's not on the list, it's not going to happen. It can't happen. It's just, that's impossible. No, we can't put 3 sugars in your coffee because, we only have 2 sugars per person, or what, I don't know, whatever. And that's an exaggeration. But, whereas in South Africa, it's like, oh, you wanted 3 sugars. Well, you know what? I don't have them, but just let me run next door and I'll go and ask the neighbor if I can just get a bit extra. And it's just a different feel.
Yeah. It reminds me of a study that one of our guests alluded to last year that was done of some seminarians. They had just listened to a lecture on the Good Samaritan, and they were to go do a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And some of them were artificially rushed, and others had time, and they encountered someone in need on the way there. And those who were rushed didn't stop to attend, by and large, the person in need, and those who had time did. And it's a very sobering, I think, study to realize the way in which our sense of time and our sense of being rushed has a profound impact upon our morality, if you will, right? Is that we'll often have this kind of sense of course I should help, of course I will help. But in that place of being rushed, or the next thing, or the next consumerist thing, whatever it might be, that's giving us a sense of imminence, that the next thing has to be done, it can very much undercut, again, seeing the humanity of the person right in front of us.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll be right back after this break. Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Would you maybe describe briefly for us the work that was done, the agenda of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and then perhaps describe for us what went well, some of the things that went well in that process, and some of the things that did not go well in that process?
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created by an act of Parliament. The idea of the commission was the apartheid government and the representatives of the apartheid government wanted something that looked like a Chilean amnesty, that there would be a blanket amnesty for perpetrators of all abuses of human rights during the apartheid era, and we would just kind of wipe the state clean and move on. The liberation movements wanted Nuremberg-style trials, that you were going to bring every perpetrator of a human rights abuse to trial. Neither of the parties was strong enough to actually impose its demand on the organization that created the new South Africa, or was able to impose its negotiating position. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was actually a compromise, that in exchange for amnesty, perpetrators would have to tell the truth about what it was that they had done, the human rights abuses that they had committed, and so forth. And so the commission came into being. For many perpetrators, they hadn't realized how strong the research arm of the commission was going to be. The apartheid government had been very much like the Nazis in terms of being quite meticulous about record keeping. And so that combination of meticulous record keeping, good research, and the recall of those who had been victims all combined to create a situation where it was beneficial, that many perpetrators decided that actually it was to their benefit to come and appear before the commission. So the things that went well and really well, that perpetrators did come before the commission, did tell the story. And for many families who would never have known the truth of what happened to their loved ones, it was a grace, shall I say, that the stories of what happened to their loved ones didn't get brushed under the carpet. That was one. For the victims who had survived, to have the truth of their experiences verified. One of the challenges with a Nuremberg-style trial is that for the perpetrators, it's in their interest to lie. It's in their interest to say, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, it wasn't me, you're crazy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so for the victim who knows what they experience, it's crazy making. That, you have somebody sitting across from you saying, it wasn't me, I wasn't there, you don't know me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that just deepens the trauma. And so for the South Africans who had experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that at least was one of the things that happened. This was that perpetrators offered an apology. They weren't required to, but very often those apologies came spontaneously and victims offered forgiveness. And that was really moving. The third thing that went really well was that we then had a common history of South Africa. So under apartheid, each racial group had its own story of what it was to be South African. And that finally there was a whole story that was true across the nation of this is what it has meant to be South African, and this is how we have been divided, and this is how we are now united under a common history. So those things went really well. Some of the things that didn't really work. Number one was that the perpetrators were pretty immediately granted amnesty. They went to an amnesty commission, they were granted amnesty, it was done. The idea had been that the Human Rights Committee of the Commission was going to make recommendations to the government about what should be done as reparations for victims. And so for victims, they heard the truth, they had an apology, but they weren't given any kind of reparation. And then by the time that the commission had actually finished its work and submitted its recommendations, the government had changed, and it was now the government of Thabo Mbeki, and the government of Mbeki was really not interested in making any kind of reparation or recompense to victims. So that was one of the things that didn't go well. And one of the other things that didn't go well was in terms of who it was who got to testify and to articulate what it was that they needed. So the mothers and grandmothers got to talk about what the impact had been on them and how they had been victimized. But very often the children or those who had been children when their parents had been killed or disappeared or whatever weren't brought to testify for the commission. And so the impact on them kind of got lost in the shuffle as well. And so it could be that a mother would say, well, I'm willing to forgive. And the child is saying, well, wait a minute, what about me? And so those two were really big things. And then the third really big thing was that disconnect between forgiveness and peace. That for perpetrators, it was like, okay, great, you've wiped the slate clean, you've given me my forgiveness, I can take it and off I go to live my merry life, and I keep all of my toys. Or in fact, not all of my toys, all of the toys. So I keep all of the advantages that the apartheid system gave me and kind of waltz off into the wild blue yonder. Plus, I have your forgiveness as well. And so I have all the things. And so you see even now in South Africa, the deep economic disparities between Black and white. And you hear young white South Africans saying, well, it wasn't me. I wasn't a perpetrator. I wasn't there. And, the fact that I'm sitting in a mansion with a swimming pool and servants has nothing to do with the injustice of apartheid.
Thank you. To return kind of to where we started, your vocation as a priest, you went through a difficult season recently in which the Anglican Church in South Africa asked you to surrender your license. Mm-hmm. What was that experience like for you? How has that tested you, frustrated you, or further formed you?
It's funny because in South Africa at that time, I was serving under license because I was canonically resident in the US. So I was an Episcopal priest living in South Africa and was able to serve because I had a license from the local bishop saying that I could serve. Then the license was taken away. My primary role at that time was the executive director of the Desmond Tutu Legacy Foundation. So my priestly vocation wasn't my main role. My main role was in the Legacy Foundation. And so technically, it shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did. It felt devastating to me. It felt like being thrown out of the house. You're no longer welcome here. You're not one of us. You're not a child of this household. Yeah, it was excruciating, actually. And I was surprised that it was excruciating.
How has that alienation continued, or has there been some sort of reconciliation in that regard, or what's that continued to look like?
The Anglican Church in South Africa, the issue of human sexuality continues to be a live issue. They haven't landed anywhere, or they have landed somewhere, but they haven't landed yet in a place that recognizes that we are all human beings of different sexual expressions. And so I can still not exercise my priestly ministry in South Africa.
Thank you for sharing that. As we come to a close here, I wonder if you would perhaps consider giving us, out of your rich experience, rich life experience, and the variety of pressing issues on human societies and communities that you've weathered, you've navigated, you've worked in, what would it look like for you to call us to courage? How could you exhort us to resilience and courage, and or speaking up, or working on behalf of our communities, or working on behalf of justice, or bearing witness to the God who is love that you began with?
I think I would end actually where I began, that God is love. And we are made in the image and likeness of God. And so we are constantly called to be love, not only as a feeling or an emotion, but as a way of being in the world. We are called to be constantly reminded of who it is and whose it is that we are. And so at this time in the world, when things feel hard and scary, uncertain, the gift that God gives to us is that image of the Christ child who comes as a vulnerable baby. And how is it that we can be vulnerable before each other? Not a calculated vulnerability of, I know what's going to happen next, but the genuine vulnerability of, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I am going to step out in love, knowing that the God of love has always got my back, has always extended an invitation to me to be that loving person that God has created me to be.
Been talking to Reverend Canon Mpho Tutu van Furth. Thank you so much for your time with us today and your lovely sharing with us. We're so thankful.
Thank you, and many blessings to you.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Mpho Tutu van Furth. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's a simple truth. No matter who you are, mental health challenges can affect you, and how you manage them can make all the difference. That's why everyone should have access to mental health support that meets them where they are and helps them get through. BetterHelp provides online therapy on your schedule. It's flexible, simple to use, and more affordable than in-person therapy. Connect with a licensed therapist selected just for you. Learn more at betterhelp.com. That's betterhelp.com.